Hello, and thank you for coming to Interact Manchester on the day that Jeremy Corbyn has announced neoliberalism is broken, for a discussion about neoliberalism. Almost like, Ben, do you want to give us the format of the event?
Yes. Hello. Hiya. So people who haven't been before, our speakers will open up for about 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes. We'll then give them the right to reply to each other. Short break, so we get drinks, or a cigarette, whatever, and then to a Q&A with the audience. We do put the events on for free, but there are running costs, so we will be shaking donations here, if you've got a bit of change to give us. And we'll be announcing our next event at the end, and it's really, really good. It's an all-day event here in the 4th of November.
Special event. So before we get started, we'll just announce our panel, going from right to left, so to speak. We have James Woodhousen, who's a visiting professor at the University of South London. We have Grace Blakely, who is a researcher at the IPPR, and we have Charlie Winston Stanley, who is the data officer for Manchester Momentum, benefactor of my most sincere apologies, and a Labour Party activist. James, shall we start with you then? For the podcast there, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate Manchester and Interact. They made a mistake inviting me, but it's great the turnout. And I know I'm from London, I'm very sorry about that. London is Quango Central, so I'm very pleased to be out of that morass. And I like the north, and we may turn to housing, because whenever I wrote and spoke about housing, I always found the reception to my proposal for mass manufactured housing much more favourable in the north than in London, where the basic response in housing, as in everything else, is you can't do that. Now, I do recognise one or two facets of neoliberalism. Speaking about infrastructure, which I know is important to Grace's job at the IPPR, I am very conscious that the Treasury in particular is much more, if you take railways, much more interested in price signals than railway signals. And, well, that went down wrong. And, that does show their infatuation with stupid economic theories and all of that. And I also recognise that part of the neo bit of the neoliberalism is it's not just supposed to be laissez-faire, which was the state getting out of everything. With neoliberalism, so its theorists suggest, its critics I should say, the state does organise markets, plays an active role in deregulation, upholds property rights, and in particular wants to crush the labour movement. If you take Paul Mason's book, which if you can spell my name, you can find a long and critical review of. So I get all of that, and I can see some of that, but I don't recognise it as a useful concept, neoliberalism, and I want to suggest to you that there's much more to the world than its critics suggest. Now, the first point to ask is, when did it begin in their view? And already we get a sort of blurring of what's going on, because some people maintain that it was with Pinochet in Chile in 1973. Mason himself says all of these things. Some say it's with Jim Callaghan in the 70s. I know none of you know who these people are because you're so sprightly, but I know who they are. Some people say it's with Thatch, 79, and then perhaps most convincingly you could say it was to do with the end of the Cold War. Now you could say, well look, James, don't be pedantic, it's a sort of gradual trend, and it's building to a crescendo. I think it is quite interesting, just as a footnote, to notice that Ernst Schumacher, one of the godfathers of Green, in his Small is Beautiful in 1973, same time as Pinochet, just coincidentally, did coin the phrase natural capital, did believe that green things, and the countryside and rivers and stuff like that, were capital, and then we see after that a whole series of efforts, properly opposed by my mortal rival, George Monbiot, to put a price on nature. And I just for once, because open-minded. I think George is right. You can't put a price on nature. It's stupid. So in terms of the sort of simple man's, my view of neoliberalism, you know, is it as Wilde once said, you know, that they know the price of everything and the value of nothing? Yes, they are very vulgar, and this is where the price signals come in. But apart from the date of origin, I just want to say that, and I've got all the numbers on my laptops, the only reason it's out is if you go to the OECD, I'd rather not, and you look up general public expenditure as a proportion of GDP, you will find that it's broadly on the rise, has been rising, and has not collapsed since 1995, since 2008, when it took a dip because they had to clean up the mess, and then it's been back up again. And I can give you the numbers, but just as an indication, the 2015 numbers for the total public expenditure in the United States, which the critics of neoliberalism would suggest ought to be down in 10%, 20%, it's 37.6% of American GDP is spent on public expenditure. Well, that's the proportion of public expenditure compared with GDP. And that's more than Ireland, more than Korea, more than Switzerland, and interestingly, more than Russia. Now you could say, James, you're being naive. A lot of that is defence. I specialise in defence. 3.3% of that 37.6 is defence. You could say, especially after Charlottesville and everything, well, what about public order? What about it? I say, well, only 2% is spent on public order. That's less than Spain, you can see why right now, Greece, our Syriza friends, Hungary and Poland, and the Slovak Republic. So even if you go to a European sort of bastion of reputedly free market neoliberal doctrine, Switzerland, in 2005, 34.02% of Swiss GDP was on public expenditure. Today, it's 33.89%, so it's actually marginally up. And I'll give you all the numbers for education and health and so on, but remarkably, health has gone in the United States from 6.5 in 95, in the year 95, to 8.92 in 2010, to 9.081 in 2015. So even health expenditure, which is, health in the US is kind of the acme of how awful the right can be, as we all know. You know, if you're run over, can you pay, and all of that. Even there, public expenditure in the state is a major reality in the US, even in healthcare, partly for demographic reasons and so on. So, you know, as a watertight concept, you know, that goes a bit further than, yes, there are a bunch of price vulgarians, I don't really buy neoliberalism. And if you take the important thing that Paul Mason suggests, I don't know what my colleagues here want to say, but if you take crushing the labour movement, doesn't that have a bit more to do with the weakness of the left than the ferocity of the Cameron regime, or the equal ferocity of, what was her name now? Theresa May, that's it, yeah. I can't see it, right? I've been battened charged by the police outside Pentonville prison in the 70s. I've been thrown into prison by the French authorities, and I'm not really seeing the level of repression that one would expect after 30 or 40 years of neoliberalism. Unemployment is low, it's declining even in Spain. This is what incidentally gives the lie to the automation is taking all our jobs scenario. It's not, they're not investing in automation. It's a lot of talk, but it's not happening. And if we really are in a neoliberal economy, what about the fact that the CBI calls for wage rises? We're not getting the wage rises, we understand that it's purely rhetorical, but it is a historical departure for the Confederation of British Industry to say, no, we need wage rises. That's new in my 45 years of activism in the labour movement and on the left. I think the concept of neoliberalism doesn't also deal with, I just hinted at this about automation, with the innovation crisis that exists in the West. There is more state expenditure in Korea on R&D every year. It's going up and up. Same in Korea, it's quite right-wing, quite free market, right? Although, again, broader state expenditure, not just on R&D. is on the up in Korea, it's on the up in China, it's on the up under Modi, although it's still no good, in India. So I don't think the concept of neoliberalism deals with these new realities and the weakness of investment, the weakness of innovation, and those things. That isn't, in fact, my major objection. I think it's a misplaced criticism that is made of neoliberalism, because it's not really deregulating. It does liberalise stuff. But if you work for BT, and I've consulted for my sins for BT, you'll find that the main thing that calls the shots in BT is their regulation unit. They're always discussing much more than putting in broadband. You know that technology is increasing exponentially. Everything's exponentially unless you want a broadband line in Manchester in a hurry, in which case you'll have to wait a long, long time. The reason you have to wait a long, long time is they're much more interested in discussing Ofcom at BT. Ofcom's alive and well inside BT, really. So it's not deregulation, there's some liberalisation. It's not the old nationalised industry. But the state is forever tweaking, and government and corporations are already always getting more and more interested in the regulatory dimension of what they do. And in fact, the state has blurred the boundaries between the private and the public in the realm of the corporation. Much more importantly, though, it's blurred the boundaries between the private and the public in our everyday lives. And if you take Public Health England, right, I don't know whether you followed it, I'm sure you have, but do you really want to go down to the local hospital and have an exercise class, a facial, you should be walking faster in order to stay thin, you need, the one good thing they're saying is let children play out a bit more. That's good, and Jeremy Corbyn, to his credit, has supported that. But in every other dimension, whether it's food, fags, obesity, parenting, you name it, they are really intruding the state more and more in people's lives to an extent that never happened under Callaghan, under Wilson. That's what Tony Blair was all about. That's what the third way was all about. It wasn't rabid deregulation. There was liberalisation. Of course they made concessions to the capitalists. Of course they did that. But the new event, which is not so new now, is this sort of psychobabble that they do all the time about, you're all mentally ill, we're all vulnerable, we're all victims, we need to see a psychiatrist. As Sam Goldwyn said, the Metro Goldwyn Mayor, anybody who sees a psychiatrist needs his head examined. I know that's very offensive, I'm very sorry about all the mentally ill people here. But just to conclude, if I haven't pissed you all off already, the state does have a role in my constructive conception of the future, right? And that is, you should do a lot more R&D, big time, right? Because you can't rely on the capitalists to do it, because it's a long-term affair, R&D, and they're all on the quarterly business results. It should play a big role in building new industries, mass-produced housing, HS2, but I'd rather have the Hyperloop, thanks, across the Pennines, and all of that. It ought to get behind that. It ought to raise the level of public debate about the Hyperloop. It should be making all kinds of other new industries, which I've written about, and I'm very happy to discuss. But just if you take the north, housing and transport, it could be doing a lot in all of that. And one of the things it ought to do in housing, paradoxically, if we're broad-minded, is it should deregulate the land. If you go down to the British Library and you get the Town and Country Planning Act of 1948, 47, it's that thick. Since then, there's been 5 decades, 6 decades of more planning, more regulation, so you can't even put up a conservatory off the A6 or whatever it is without somebody coming in and telling you you can't do it. If you deregulated the land, the Daily Mail would be very upset, but land values would decline because you could build nearly everywhere, including on the green belt, otherwise known as scrub. And obviously we preserve for our green friends national parks and all the rest of it, but land values would drop, and it's land that constitutes 2/3 of the value of a house. It's not the building, it's the land. So if we want affordable housing, cheap housing, housing that doesn't leak, that has the Wi-Fi built in, that has the solar panels built in, that is iPod homes or iPad homes, or whatever it is, then we can get the factories to do it. Hooray, they won't do it down in London, but they will do it up in Manchester, where they actually understand what the word engineering means. But hand in hand with mass manufacture, we actually have to deregulate the land. Does this make me a neoliberal? I hope you'll see further than that. The final way that the state should intervene is that it should, in building the new industries and putting money behind automation, a lot of people may be made redundant. It should be much more generous and serious, not about providing benefits for victims to the limited extent that it does now, but providing really serious training and financial transitional measures to allow workers displaced from the old industries, which are actually a lot of the time still kept alive by the state. Britain has an extremely weak bankruptcy regime. A lot of firms need to go bankrupt. I'm sorry to say it, but if you were to build new jobs that are high-skill, high-tech, competitive, fun, new industries, rather than sort of, grubbing around with private taxi firms and all of that, you need to get serious about transitional measures, because those taxi drivers need jobs. They won't get them immediately with new industries. That takes time. So the state should step in on that. I don't mind the state. I do mind it intruding in my private life, and I wish Jeremy would say something about Public Health England. I've done a Google search. I couldn't see anything that he said about it except play out. It doesn't seem to be part of his landscape, what's happening with the alcohol warnings, the cigarette warnings, the vaping warnings, and basically the warnings culture. It's all an attack, mostly on the fat, white, beer-drinking working class up north, who are all racist bigots, as we understand, because they voted Brexit. And if you don't want to be part of that Blairite kind of denunciation of normal people, then I hope you'll join me in saying neoliberalism, schmeoliberalism, but we need a wider critique of today's capitalism, not the Pinochet stuff or whatever it was that began 40 years ago. Thank you so much.
Right, hi everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'm Grace. I'm a researcher at the IPR. We're a centre-left think tank, and I work on our Commission on Economic Justice, which is a 2-year programme looking at the kind of structural issues within the UK economy and coming up with innovative solutions to deal with them. And if you'll excuse me, I'm slightly croaky. I've just come back from 2 very fun days at a very festive, unusually festive Labour Party conference. So yeah, sorry about my voice. So I'm just going to start. I'm just going to talk a bit about kind of intellectual history of neoliberalism, as far as I kind of understand it, and then I will talk a little bit about my specialism, which is the British economy. What are the kind of the underlying structural issues, and how do they relate to the kind of economic wisdom of today? So let's start by having a little bit of intellectual clarity about what neoliberalism is. I've got David Harvey's definition here, and David Harvey's written a book called Literary Neoliberalism, so it's kind of seminal work on the subject. If you'll permit me to read out a fairly normal definition. Neoliberalism is, in the first instance, a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. Now, anyone familiar with kind of, philosophy or general economic history knows that that's not a particularly new idea. It dates back for quite a while. But its particular instantiation as it is now dates back to kind of the monetarists of the 1980s. So in the kind of 60s and 70s, you have what's called the post-war consensus, built on the work of Keynes, who wrote a lot about the post-war consensus was built on a kind of a fairly interventionist role for the state, but primarily what Keynes was interested in was investment and therefore interest rates and the money supply. So the Keynesian view was in order to kind of promote economic growth, stimulate employment, you need to have low interest rates to encourage businesses to invest. And this came alongside Keynes' big innovation was essentially disaggregating the short run from the long run in economics. So he said that even if in the long run everything kind of balances out, in the long run we're all dead, and in the short run there can be kind of deficits of demand that are created by kind of irrational market forces. So you need state investment to kind of smooth those things out. And in the background throughout the 60s and 70s, you have this broadly shared prosperity in the post-war period. There were a group of people working systematically to kind of undermine this, and part of that was ideological reasons, part of it was kind of self-interest and other more nefarious things. But these people grouped together at what was called the Mont Pelerin Society. So this was a society in Switzerland. They all came together to chat about what they saw as the problems with Keynes and the post-war consensus. And some of these you may have heard of. There was Hayek, Friedman, all the kind of famous economic gurus at the time. So one of the biggest differences actually is between neoliberalism and Keynes, aside from all the things we just talked about, so free markets, individual liberty, all that sort of stuff, was their views on money. So the monetarists, hence the name, subscribed to what was called the quantity theory of money. So they believed that the value of money is determined by how much of it there is. Contra Keynes, who kind of basically believed that, as I said, you needed to have low interest rates in order to promote investment generally. The monetarists thought that the primary role of the state was to guarantee the value of money, so kind of put limits on the amount of money being created, and keep interest rates high in order to prevent inflation, because, well, they argued that inflation hurts ordinary people, which is of course true. And the monetarists were working in the background for a long, long time. Hayek was writing Road to Serfdom, Friedman was kind of engaging lots of different people, and they had a really coherent vision for what they wanted, which was, as I said, free markets, individual liberty, controls on the value of money, all that sort of stuff. And they also had a really coherent vision for change. So they were in Mont Pelerin. They were like, how do we completely and utterly undermine public wisdom on what economics is and should be? And they set up a network of think tanks. So, I worked for a think tank, but on the left, there was a lot of think tanks that emerged in the 70s and 80s. The IEA, for example, was set up by Mont Pelerin to just completely change the public debate on economics and start bringing in all these things that we now kind of count as economic common sense. So, you've got to pay off your debt, and the state should stay out of your lives as much as possible. All that kind of common sense does date back to this particular monetarist view, neoliberal view, that came about during the 70s. And they also influenced a series of politicians, as we know, and they used the crises of the 1970s. So you had the two oil shocks combined with a balance of payments crisis in the US and serious labour market crisis in the UK. And these kinds of paradigm shifts always require crises to kind of embed themselves. So after that crisis, you get Thatcher coming to power in the UK, you get Reagan coming to power in the US, and they start really implementing some of these neoliberal reforms. So privatisation, labour market reforms, kind of consistent attacks on trade unions, very high interest rates. In the 80s, you have the Volcker shock, where interest rates go up massively in the States, and aside from kind of all the misery that created in the US, it led to a debt crisis all around the rest of the world as capital flooded back into America. So, and this also was another kind of, increase in the rate of change in terms of globalization, in terms of the interconnectedness of the world. And the current, the type of globalization that we see now was really embedded during the 1980s. So this was all about free movement of capital as opposed to free movement of labour. So keeping labour in one place but allowing capital to kind of roam all around the world, promoting financialization and creating kind of very financialized economy in the city of London and also on Wall Street. And so these reforms did, do what they were supposed to do. They dealt with the inflation crises, currency problems, but at the cost of decimating the UK's manufacturing base, hurting particularly the regions, creating mass unemployment and dramatically increasing inequality. And obviously the integration of the UK into international capital markets sealed the deal in terms of the power of finance over our economy and also our politics. And then, of course, as Thatcher liked to say, her greatest success was Tony Blair. So by 1997, this wisdom was really very much embedded. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, broadly speaking, this shift from Keynes to Hayek can be described as a paradigm shift. So it's a change in the common sense, change in the way in which people view the world, how economics is discussed, how we think of the state, our very concept of what it means to have a kind of a strong economy was transformed during this time, partly because of the coherent work of people like Hayek and Friedman behind the scenes, but partly because of this sense of crisis that came about in the 80s. So the question is, I think, the title of this debate is neoliberalism, end of the line, right? So are we coming to the end of neoliberalism? And I think to ask that, we have to ask ourselves, are we at a similar moment of a paradigm shift right now? In terms of the kind of stuff behind the scenes, you certainly had an explosion of kind of new thinking in economics since the financial crisis. So over the last 10 years, what we call heterodox economics has really taken off. And I mean, you've got in Manchester the work of post-crash economics and debunking economics, looking at all the kind of systemic failures of the economics establishment, particularly in academia, to deal with a lot of the questions that are faced in the real economy. But ultimately, as I mentioned, crises are really needed for change to happen. So are we currently in a moment of crisis? And this is where I come onto some of the work that I've been doing as part of the Commission on Economic Justice. So to kind of go back to some of what we've just heard, so GDP is allegedly going fairly strongly. Employment is actually the highest it's ever been since records began, partly because you've now got more women involved in the labour force, but even unemployment is at record lows. So the task of the Commission has been to say, okay, well, if everything's going so well, then why is there this pervasive feeling that actually things aren't that great? And the story of our interim report is basically that, aside from GDP and employment, when you look below those headline figures, there are some serious structural issues with the UK economy. And this is why there isn't this sense that actually of prosperity and that things are going well, especially everywhere outside London. So just, if you'll permit me, some fun stats. This has been the slowest recovery of any major recession since the 1970s. At a corresponding stage of recovery, in 1970, GDP was 6%, 1980, 19%, and the 1990s, 18% higher. And so, this is the familiar business cycle that some of you will have heard of. Generally, you'll have a crisis, things will go, GDP will go down, and it will come back up again. This hasn't happened this time, and that's really quite remarkable. Productivity, which is the only thing you can really rely on to increase economic growth over the long term, has stagnated, as many of you know. It's now 13% below the G7 developed economy average. Employment may be at record levels, but people work fewer hours than they would like. There's about 8% underemployment. The number of people on 0 hours contracts has increased more than 500% since 2007. Self-employment has increased from 13% of the workforce to 15% today, in 2008, to 15% today. And self-employed people earn, on average, much less than they did 20 years ago. So this is the phenomenon of false self-employment in the gig economy. The really, in many ways, tragic thing has been the story on wages, and we've seen some of this recently. So median wages today are only 5% higher than they were in 2007. And real wages now, so that's wages accounting for inflation, so what people are going to use as wages to buy, have now been negative. And this has been the longest period of wage stagnation since the 18th century. So this is really quite remarkable. Alongside this, and this is something I'm particularly passionate about as well, there's been an explosion in household debt. So this is obviously tied to the stagnation in real wages, but it's also tied to the kind of explosion in what is essentially usury we have now. So there's this idea in kind of neoclassical economics that the rate that the Bank of England charges on interest, which is historically low levels, is the rate paid by consumers, and that's why you get greater borrowing and more economic activity when you have low interest rates. But actually, the transmission mechanism is completely short. And as any of you who have a credit card know, we're paying 20, 25, 30, sometimes 500% interest on our debt, which leaves people kind of trapped in this spiral of indebtedness. And average household debt now stands at 142% of household income. If this continues, household debt will surpass its 2008 peak in under 3 years' time. And as we know, the financial crisis connected to the real economy in the form of a debt crisis. But this bleak picture doesn't actually reflect the experience of everyone in the UK. So company chief executives are now paid 150 times the salary of the average worker, up from 20 times just 30 years ago. Between 2010 and 2015, average pay for FTSE 100 directors rose 47%, often unrelated to the performance of their companies. And actually only 10% of the wealth generated since 1979 has gone to the bottom 50% of the income spectrum. So 50% of people on the bottom have got 10% of growth we've experienced since 79. And when you look at the geographical spread of these stats, then it's even starker. The UK is now the most regionally unequal country in Europe, with 40% of our national income produced in London and the South East. Median incomes in the North West, West Midlands, the South West and Wales are more than 40% lower in London. So, all this sounds very bleak, but is it quite enough to create a crisis? And the answer is no, right? You can have a steady, secular trend slow down in the economy without creating a crisis. But there are also severe issues in financial markets at the moment. So when you look at market capitalization to GDP, so the amount of money that's in financial markets, without getting too technical, the capital markets become much more volatile as partly a result of quantitative easing, which has involved the Bank of England printing lots and lots of money, well, kind of, but with computers, so not with printing presses, and essentially giving it to banks, which use that for their speculation and channeling that money into capital markets, which has created a series of bubbles in lots of different sectors, which could potentially pop at any time. So on their own, these two issues, the financial market instability and huge levels of debt in finance markets, and the structural weakness of the economy, if those two things were happening in isolation, you wouldn't potentially be that worried. But the fact that they're both happening together at the same time means that we could be heading for 2008 2.0 at any point. All it ever really takes to kind of spark off these things is a catalyst. And we have the catalyst par excellence on the horizon in 2 years when we finally leave the European Union. So that could potentially be the crisis that allows for that creates the end of neoliberalism, essentially. You mentioned earlier that the 1920s and the kind of the period of laissez-faire that was kind of almost the first instantiation of liberalism or liberal economics. And at that time, there was a man writing called Karl Polanyi, who's had a bit of a resurgence recently, partly because everything he says when he's writing about the 1920s seems to apply today. And aside from all the kind of other amazing arguments he makes, what he says is that liberalism at the time, laissez-faire, is a hegemonic utopian project, right? It has this idea that basically you can treat people as if they're commodities, and you can kind of force huge amounts of kind of suffering, you can ignore laws of necessity, you can make them work for almost nothing in order to promote some abstract concept of human freedom, right? And that is an essentially utopian project. But when you actually try and implement it, there's only so much that people can take. And eventually, you will come to a wall and people will start to react against that utopian project. And all it takes is a crisis. And I would argue that we are on the cusp of such a crisis. Whether or not neoliberalism is replaced with something more transformative or just kind of continued chaos is, I would argue, up to us. So, thanks very much.
Unfortunately, it's rendered some of my planned introduction redundant, so it's always the risk of going last. But yeah, no, thank you to Interact Manchester for having me down to speak here, and thanks to both fellow speakers. So I've been asked to speak tonight on the much more end of neoliberalism. Obviously, as I'm sure a lot of us will have noticed, the neoliberal consensus has been severely damaged since the recent financial crash, as Grace has just very adequately displayed. I disagree with James here. I think you can actually define neoliberalism. I think that there's a mixture of financial deregulation, fiscal austerity, and tax cuts. Not necessarily a decline in state expenditure, and certainly not a decline in state debt. But I think that those three facets are clear examples of neoliberal policies enacted. And I think it's worth noting that the countries who are most committed to fiscal austerity in Europe have been, again, as Grace said, amongst the worst in terms of the recovery from the 2007 crash. We've got examples like Greece, Ireland, until recently Spain, the UK. It's a clear parallel here. Our recovery as a proportion of the economy in terms of employment is basically on par with Greece. it's terrible. So there's lots of grand political movements at the moment which are arching their backs across the Western world, promising in different guises a movement away from policies of privatisation, austerity, deregulation and free trade. So you've got Trump in the US, you've got Le Pen in France, the AFL and Die Linke have both done really well in the German elections recently, the Communist Party in Portugal, you've got Syriza in Greece, of course we've got Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party here in the UK. All of them, from right and the left, are promising a mixed bag of policy offers which are completely alien to neoliberalism, from protectionism, state investment in industry, higher tax over the wealthy, nationalisation and increased financial regulation. But I guess the open question is, are these themes harbingers of an apocalypse for neoliberalism? And all I can say is, I hope so, but I'm not sure. And here's where I might agree slightly more with James, is that to a certain degree, I think that neoliberalism has actually been dead for some time already. Self-identified neoliberal thinkers are pretty much extinct. As a school of economic thought, neoliberalism has produced nothing new in the way of international global analysis critique for quite a while. It hasn't introduced any new methodology for dealing with recent crises. It hasn't really produced any public political exponent coming out and talking about neoliberalism. Neoliberal thinkers are not producing books anymore like they were in the 1980s. As an intellectual tendency, it seems to be dead. As an ideology, which achieved its heyday in the 70s and 80s, it was already in decline by the 90s. And was also an ideology which singularly failed in every practical example of application in the real world. What we're left with today really is more what I would call a neoliberal residue. It's a reflexive and somewhat unthinking policy response which is trained into our economic experts and politicians. Neoliberalism is really, you could describe it as the muscle memory of our policy wonks. They reflexively engage in fiscal austerity when faced with a crisis. There's not really an analysis of how this works, it's just the orthodoxy. But I think going back to the history, and again, I think Grace did a really good job on history, but I'll try and go back and just talk a little bit more about some of the Keynesian sort of oppositional sort of elements to this beforehand. I think the school of neoliberalism emerged as a counterweight to the Keynesian post-war consensus, where Keynes had posited the importance of specifically counter-cyclical spending from the state, so particularly during eras of economic decline. And Keynes' ideas were forged really because of the total failure of free market policies in the interwar years to revitalise Western economies, with obviously tragic results. So after 1918, a debt chain ran throughout Europe, with Britain owing to the US and the European allies owing to Britain, and at the bottom there was a total inability to begin the process of repayments. The answer at the time was that Germany should pay for it all, and that resulted in the Versailles Treaty, which is often attributed with the rise of nationalist resentment within Germany, which fed into an incipient Nazi movement. Further to this, there was a credit crisis due to unrecoverable loans during this period, which really sparked the Great Crash in 1931, which in turn led to price wars between the Western nations, each devaluing their currencies to gain a competitive advantage over each other, in line with the classical liberal economic orthodoxy, the classical liberal as opposed to the neoliberal. And the result, of course, of World War II. In response to this chaos, Keynes turned the founding supposition of the classical liberal economist on its head. So where traditionally liberal economists have claimed that supply creates its own demand, in Keynes's mind, demand creates its own supply. For being quite a simple rhetorical inversion, the consequences of this principle were very significant. Economics have traditionally focused on the availability and cost of labour power as the most significant factor in spurring economic activity. So this isn't just some sort of Marxist critique of neoliberalism, this is actually embedded into classical liberal thought. Labour supply was always represented in terms of available workers and low wages. So it was theorised that in times of crisis, the supply of labour should be increased to incentivise production, reducing wages, making work less secure, and creating a bank of unemployed people willing to work anywhere. This was the classical liberal economic model for dealing with crisis, reduce the cost of labour. Keynes argued inversely that it was actually the presence of demand for products in the market which spurred production. So rather than reducing working conditions, Keynes argued that the state should invest in construction projects, research and production to kickstart the market, create new jobs, get people into work so that they had an income with which to further increase demand for goods and services. The success of Keynesian ideas is really what led to the post-war economic consensus, in which Western governments embarked upon widespread social infrastructural investment projects that were propping up the market whenever it failed. Internationally, the Keynesian consensus was represented by the Bretton Woods Agreement, which, in a great historical irony, two of the main institutions associated with this agreement are now associated with neoliberal domination, that is the World Bank and the IMF, but were originally set up as a Keynesian solution to regulate global trade and make sure that there weren't too many imbalances in relative trade deficits between different countries, to try and even out the trade deficits and ultimately normalise, regularise economic relations between different countries. Keynes' ideas were basically developed around the central distrust of the market as a mechanism to effectively distribute wealth, and a commitment on behalf of the state and other non-market political mechanisms to step in where it failed to do so. But I think here's where the real defining part of neoliberals come in, because contrary to Keynes, the neoliberals basically wished to resurrect not all but some of the classical liberal ideals. So one central aspect of the classical liberal ideals which the neoliberals wished to reinvent was the importance of the price mechanism, put it right back at the heart of economic orthodoxy. And these ideas were inspired by really abstract concepts of interpersonal freedom and expressed by early thinkers such as Friedrich Hayek. So for Hayek, unregulated markets provided a structure for voluntary human interactions, which he believed were intrinsically challenging to repressive political systems. They were also seen as partial rejoinders to the failings of the classical liberal school, and a role was actually seen for the state. So monetarism, which was Milton Friedman's baby, extolled that the most important facet of growth and market exchange was stable currency. So the value of currency was dictated by the quantity of that currency in the market, and that the central bank should play an active role in regulating the quantity of money in circulation in order to control inflation. Supply-side economics, the slight sort of different sort of tendency on this, was developed under Ronald Reagan, which was a desire to rehabilitate the supply creates its own demand concept, but have a slightly less anti-worker slant on it. So supply-siders, rather than just seeing labour as the central sort of issue with regards to economic success, saw taxation as the primary obstacle to growth, and they postulated that state revenue would actually be increased by reducing taxes, spurring growth and increasing base revenues. And on the whole, I think you can safely define this neoliberal school of thought as a tendency to see the market as a system through which demand can be organically and continually reassessed from the point of the consumer, encouraging innovation, improvisation and creativity, constantly reacting and adapting to new environments. Which makes it quite ironic that some of the first implementations of these neoliberal principles occurred through Latin American dictatorships. I'll actually go for before Pinochet as an example. I'd say 1976, the Argentinian military junta, under the advice of the neoliberal economist Martina de Hoz, actually was the first government, I think, to formally adopt the neoliberal school ideas and start embarking upon a string of neoliberal policies designed to spur growth. So they imposed fiscal austerity in line with the monetarist method. Public sector salaries were frozen with the intention of putting an end to inflation. Borders were open to facilitate trade, taxes reduced, and the financial system was deregulated. Fiscal austerity immediately led to a drastic reduction in income for the working population as inflation continued and wages were devalued. Argentinian industry promptly collapsed after the opening up of trade borders, and the deregulation of finance led to complete financial ruin as domestic investment fled abroad during the Reagan era and bankers moved their assets elsewhere. Poverty during this period increased from 9% of the population in 1975 to 40% in 1982. There's loads more examples to hand, but for the sake of brevity, I'll limit it to one more in this introduction. Pre-crash Ireland is maybe the most obvious example of a failed neoliberal experiment, which is on our doorstep. Dubbed the Celtic Tiger, the Irish economy began to falter and crash in the mid-2000s, and Ireland is now the most indebted country in the EU, with a budget deficit running at 14.3% and 13.4% unemployment. Despite fiscal austerity, the deficit is growing, and young people in Ireland face an unprecedented housing crisis, with single-room flats regularly costing hundreds of euros a week to rent. It's a truly terrible situation. We've got some friends in Ireland at the moment, and it's absolutely dire. Time and time again, neoliberal policies have been found to drastically increase social inequality, which actually has a corollary impact on other areas of society. The academic Mark Fleming points to neoliberalism and the criminalisation of poverty as a major factor behind mass incarceration which we see in the USA today. So here's, I think, an answer partly to what James was talking about the increase in state spending, because I don't think neoliberalism actually has a principle against state spending, it just has a principle against market intervention. But as the welfare statement has been taken away, the social safety net, which would once have kept citizens from hitting rock bottom, has also declined. If you combine this with the increasingly precarious nature of non-unionised work, you create a situation of insecurity and economic fear, which is a hotbed for criminal activity. The privatisation of prisons has also fed into this effect, with private prisons now amongst the largest corporate lobbyists in American politics. These prisons have, with varying degrees of success, lobbied for longer prison sentences, harsher border protection regimes, and more customs control. Inside prisons themselves, prisoners are being employed en masse for as little as 23 cents per hour, making flags, mattresses, military equipment, everything under the sun. This effect has become known by some as the prison industrial complex, which is a perverse byproduct of the introduction of the profit motive into essential public service. The prison industrial complex is perhaps one of the most evocative and emotive instances of what academic Loic Vacan calls the centaur state. In response to the increasing social instability of post-neoliberal society, Vacan argues that authorities increasingly turn to punitive measures in order to temper an unruly population. And I think this is an example of where the state expenditure does not decrease, actually just gets deflected. It becomes more about social order and retaining social control when it comes about providing essential services or investing in industry, etc. And this is not the only problem caused by social inequality. In its 2016 paper entitled Neoliberalism Oversold, the IMF itself concludes three major issues on the neoliberal policies which it helped to explore around the globe. One, that the benefits of increased growth are really hard to establish over a broad group of countries. Two, that the costs of increased inequality are significant. The actual financial costs of increasing inequality are significant. I think the prison population is one potential example of that. And three, that inequality also challenges the sustainability of growth. The monetarist approach of the IMF has placed significant restrictions on the ability of developing countries to borrow and invest in scaling up their infrastructure, particularly in regards to public services and public health. The result has been a knock-on cycle of underdevelopment in which underfunded public services provide demoralising and underpaid work, leading to brain drain as employees emigrate elsewhere. Failure to upgrade infrastructure in favour of fiscal tightening exacerbates the competitivity gap between developed and undeveloped nations, making them ever less capable of escaping the debt trap. And it's now fairly well established that neoliberal policy has led to a chronic underinvestment in key infrastructure such as roads, school, energy and industry. These unintended consequences to neoliberalism build up into a catalogue of errors which collectively discredit the ideological framework in its entirety as far as I'm concerned. So over time, neoliberalism can be seen to, one, undermine national sovereignty for exacerbating national budget deficits, national debt, and undermining the ability of national governments to plan for development locally instead of allowing global financial interests and developers to call the shots. Two, remove large-scale state-owned public companies and services which inadvertently undermine the previous efficiencies associated with economies of scale. Three, erode the conditions for worker productivity, which would include decent terms and conditions, job security, etc. Four, allow for the widespread destruction of the environment and natural habitats without any adequate regulatory bodies. And five, increase the power of unaccountable global companies as opposed to accountable political systems and politicians, which effectively undermines democracy. But I guess the question here is it about to die? And I'd like to just finish here with a bit of a warning. I think the strength of neoliberalism as a school of economic thought actually lies in its fundamental alignment to the basic tenets of capitalism. For an individual with wealth, there will always be an instrumental convenience in expounding a philosophy which dictates that your own personal interest is somehow the best thing for everybody. The concept of the invisible hand both allows individual profiteers to provide themselves with a moral whitewash for their activities and to kid themselves and others that their subjective interests are the best route to general prosperity. Faith in the market mechanism, as far as I can see, effectively boils down to these motivations. There is very little in the way of aggregate evidence to show that neoliberal free market capitalism is the most effective mechanism for sustained growth, general prosperity, or anything else. So in answer to the general premise of the question, I would say I think that neoliberalism has a potential for longevity. if not as a current movement, then I think it's an idea which can very easily be re-sparked, because fundamentally it very much aligns to the core principles by which we run the basics of our economy. Until that changes, I see it as a potential danger in years to come.
Fantastic, three very clear and distinct approaches there. So we throw this back to you now to have a discussion amongst yourself. Is there anything that stands out there that you wanted to raise with any of the other speakers? James, would you like to reply? And think of the podcast.
Sure. Well, I very much value listening. I took careful notes about what Grace and Charlie have said. I agree with a lot of what you've said. First of all, I do think we are headed for, as you delightfully put it, Grace, 2008 version 2.0, right? And we will disagree whether Brexit is the outrageous catalyst for all of that. But I do agree, and I recognise also the symptoms that you and Charlie mentioned: slow recovery, rubbish productivity, growth of the gig economy, useless wages, growth of household debt, usury, inequality, especially among regions, and all of that. But I think that's a description, not an explanation. You can put all of those terms into the catch-all phrase neoliberalism, and Charlie, I wasn't saying you couldn't define it. I mean, one can define it. David Harvey, I didn't much like David Harvey, but there are lots of other people who've tried to define it. It's not just that it's blurred, it just doesn't have enough, for me, explanatory power rather than descriptive power. It's not a theory, and it doesn't adjust to any of the things that neither of you took up, which is the kind of personal intervention in your private lives that the state is now doing. And I think that is a very real and present danger to democracy, and we have to get our brains right around that. Now, I do also like your phrase, I think I'll steal it, Charlie, actually, some serious form of flattery. I tried to talk about it with the railway signals joke, but, you know, neoliberalism, quote unquote, as the muscle memory of policy wonks, I think it's terrific. You know, all those treasury idiots, right? They wouldn't know market forces if it hit them in the face. But if we are facing, you know, crash 2.0, it's very important that we're very precise about our theory, about our history, and about our terms. Now, just a couple of points on history, forgive me, but Pinochet preceded Argentina. Right? Pinochet was 73, Argentina 76. I was there at Pinochet, not in the stadium, thank God. But you know, I demonstrated, and it was a very big deal when I was just a little younger than I am now. And second of all, in terms of you know, precision, I liked what you said, Grace, that Paul Volcker, more like, he introduced high interest rates, but as you kind of hinted, since the 2008 crash, we're all Keynesians now. We've had low interest rates, and they've done bugger all for the recovery. Right? So, you know, at the level of sort of interest rates, at least, we've been Keynesian for 10 years. It's neither a Keynesian revolution or triumph over neoliberalism, nor is it a neoliberalism, you know, triumphing over Keynesianism. It is broadly what we've got with May, which is drift happens, right? And what we've got with most of these people. So let's be a little precise about that. Now, the prison industrial complex, I'm very sympathetic to what you say there, Charlie, but I put it to you, it's not just the criminalisation of poverty in the United States. It's a bit further than, you know, Ken Loach's new film. It's a criminalisation of blacks. There are 2 million blacks in American prisons. And you can't put that just down to neoliberalism, nor can you just put it down to, well, look, we're back in Alabama in the 60s. We need to explain that. We also need to remember, as I'm sure you'll tell us, who was it who coined the phrase, the military-industrial complex? No, Eisenhower. 1960. So before we rush to identify the prison industrial complex, the intelligence industrial complex, you can fill in the phrase industrial complex, the right-wing Republican President of the United States coined that phrase. So, let's just have a little bit of precision here, not to be pedantic, but because of what you say, Grace, which is we're headed for some serious stuff. On that we can all agree. China's not going to prop us all up for the next 10 years in the way that it has done in the past. And, we need to get things very straight. Now, the merit of having this dreadful laptop here is I've just checked out the numbers. You make a very good point, and it's a delightful corrective to one symptom that I described. It's only a symptom, which is state expenditure. I've just looked up the numbers which you can confirm on state revenues as a percentage of GDP. And the United States, 1975, 29.54, and today, or 2015, 33.36. So on the tax question, it's broadly the same picture, same in Switzerland, got the numbers, right? Tax revenues have increased in the last 10, 20, 30 years, not decreased. They'd like to cut taxes. Trump would like to cut taxes. Whether he'll be able to is another matter. Just finally, on protectionism, I will be introducing a session on globalization at the Battle of Ideas on the 28th of October down in the Barbican, London. So I've done a lot of study of protectionism, and I do believe there are very important, I'm happy to discuss it, important protectionist trends building in the world economy. Having said that, if we think that neoliberalism is being overthrown by the revival of protectionism, I've got to say there are trends in that direction. But where's Trump's trade war? It could happen, right? But he's been in power a year, and we haven't got a trade war just yet. It's more likely to be war, not George war, but war. There are some trends in that direction, but we can't really. It's very important to assess these things with maximum precision, no pedantry, but precision, because the stakes, ladies and gentlemen, are pretty high, and on that we can agree.
So, quite a lot of things to come onto there, so we'll hand it over this way.
Just on a couple of small things. Accept your point on Chile, but by my notes, the actual austerity neoliberal policies began to be introduced with a heavy hand in 1978. So towards the end, later end of the 70s, just whilst we're talking about precision, I thought I'd not that one in there.
Can we have a drink about it?
Yes, yeah, we should do. And I'll just pass on to Grace.
Okay, so a couple of different things. Where to start? I think the point about interest rates is interesting. So I don't know how interested anyone's going to be in like a kind of detailed discussion of the economics on this, but I'll go with it because. So the reason obviously interest rates were put up back in the 80s was to control inflation, right? And since the financial crisis, we've had actually record low levels of inflation. And this has obviously changed now because of the devaluation of the pound, which has basically made our currency worth less in terms of exchange rates, which is then filtered into the real economy. But the fact that we've had such low interest rates and had to have such low interest rates is actually really interesting, because if we were to put interest rates up now, there could, especially if you, in the way that they were in the 1980s, it could create a very serious, deep economic crisis. And that actually exposes a lot of fundamental weaknesses at the heart of the economy right now. A lot of people are basically saying that you are going to need low levels of interest rates. In some places, rates of interest that are negative in real terms, and in places such as Sweden, negative in nominal terms as well. They have negative interest rates, which they've been able to do, which basically is charging people to hold money, right, which is insane. And economists are seriously confused about why this is happening. The productivity crisis and the fact that growth doesn't seem to be responding to low interest rates are two massive issues for the heart of economics at the moment, which a lot of kind of the economics profession are quite happy just to kind of ignore and continue to sit on computers making economic models, but which are actually, very seriously important. And there's this potential issue of what's been called, so Lawrence Summers called secular stagnation. So the fact that we're seeing across the world a slowing in rates of economic growth. And there are a whole load of alleged reasons for this that has allegedly happened. So some people put it down to kind of a slowing in the rate of technological change, which doesn't really seem to kind of bear out into when you look at the facts. One potentially really big issue is just the collapse in any sort of kind of Keynesian, so the Keynesian analysis, which is basically they've got incredibly high levels of inequality, where you have the vast majority of people are simply not able to spend in a sustainable way to prop up economic growth. So we've got a huge amount of technological change occurring, but it's essentially just benefiting the top 1%. Those gains aren't being translated into innovation in the rest of the economy, and this also underlies a lot of the productivity crisis. So we have a hollowing out of the labour market rather than a kind of generalised economic change that we saw in the Industrial Revolution as a result of technological change. You've got a lot of people, a lot of very wealthy people benefiting from, you know, the tech revolution. But this is not being felt at the bottom end of the labour market. So, you know, increasingly insecure labour, very unproductive labour, people being kind of forced to do incredibly unproductive jobs just to be on the receiving end of benefits. So, kind of, yeah, I think I was responding to the point about interest rates and then ended up talking a lot more about, to look at general structural issues in the economy. But I think, you know, that point, how it relates to neoliberalism really is the fact that these things are all happening, that there was a very coherent analysis of why these things might be occurring in the 1960s, going back to Keynes, and that since Keynes, heterodox economists have done so much to update and kind of revive his work, and yet it's just systematically ignored by policymakers who have these issues staring them in the face, and yet seem to say, we need more of the same, we need to continue to take demand out of the economy, we need to continue to kind of, I mean, yes, interest rates are low, but people at the Bank of England is now thinking, oh, we've got slightly higher levels of inflation, we might need to put these back up. Janet Yellen is thinking we might need to raise interest rates again. So yeah, the fact that, as you said, the muscle memory of policymakers is just like, oh, we have all these crises, we have no capacity to kind of think about new ways to change them, despite the fact that thinking is out there, is, I think, evidence of the strength and continued power of neoliberalism over public policy.
Thanks. And just to follow on from that as well, I think that what I was trying to say at the end about the alignment, the fundamental alignment, the principles of neoliberalism, I think is key to that. I think that's the reason why this idea will continually reoccur, is because actually it's very convenient for people who, by the nature of their position, already have a lot of money to be able to justify the idea that their selfish interactions in the economy are playing out into some more broader social good. And that's why I don't think that we should be complacent about sort of the decline of neoliberalism. And that's why I don't think we should dismiss it as a concept. The most recent iteration was neoliberalism, more traditionally it was classical liberalism, and I have absolutely no doubt that it will rear its head in another form again.
Just briefly on that, I mean, I'm not dismissing it quite like that as a concept. What I'm saying is it doesn't hold water as an articulated theory to describe what's going on today. If I could just illustrate that briefly in a simple way, I know The Guardian, I think you, Grace, or no, it was you, Charlie, referred to the IMF and its, you know, recent hostility to neoliberalism. Now, just because it's the IMF doesn't mean that it's wrong, otherwise I wouldn't be quoting the OECD. But myself, I wouldn't have the numbers all right, but just because they say neoliberalism exists and it's a bad idea, doesn't mean I'm going to run into their arms. In the same way, Lawrence Summers, who's actually upheld neoliberalism, you know, I wouldn't quote him as an authority, and I would say, you know, because I think automation and technology is very much important to the debate right now, that, you know, if you compare today's technologies with what happened in the Victorian period, there's no comparison, right? You can tweet, you can date, but you're not going to get the department store, which had lighting, sheet glass, Otis elevators, mail order catalogue, United States postal system, internal combustion engine, railroads, refrigerated railroad cars, about 8, 10, 15 innovations which were mutually interlocking, really establishing a whole new industry. We've got no new industries right today. This technology is not happening. Actually, it's what I do is run around the capitalist class telling them this, and in fact they all laugh because they know it's true, funnily enough. But it's just not happening in the way that it should. And what is happening, which I like your views on, is you mentioned, I thought very rightly, grace in the 80s globalization period, which said there was the mobility of capital, not of labour. The story of the past 10 years is plenty of mobility of capital, but a big burst in the mobility of labour, right? And from immigration and everything else. There is the self-employed, there are the working mums, but there's also the Mexicans and Hispanics in America, the Romanians and the Bulgarians here, and the Poles, obviously. That's new. It seems to me that if you read Marx's Capital, and he talks about the number of simultaneous working days and how that boosts the profit levels of the capitalists, that's much a better authority than Larry Summers or the IMF. Of course, much has changed since Marx's day, but if you take the very high levels of employment in America and Britain today and the new sort of ways in which it's being developed, then it seems to me that the overall accumulation of surplus value has benefited from that. We're going to get a lot more of that still to come, and that is by no means a whole theory, but it seems to me a more relevant explanation of what's been happening in the past 10 years with Labour. They don't invest in new technology. They get a whole load of Uber drivers and cheap labour. And that's how, people sleeping 16 to a room. That's what capitalism's about today. And I'm not sure that neoliberalism, really begins to deal with that.
So just one more response, then we'll have a short break.
So on that level, I absolutely completely agree. I think neoliberalism is completely incomprehensible, really, when you try and actually unpick what its foundations are and the relationship which is assumed between economic freedom and personal freedom. And there's so many blurs. The ideology itself, I don't think, has ever made any clear sense or ever given any real insights into the truth of the situation. My concern is, as a political force, it clearly still rules the roost anyway. There's a very good quote from Keynes, which I have to paraphrase, which talks about the dominance of economic ideas over society, even amongst straight-minded men who believe themselves not to be influenced by such matters. And actually, as an economic orthodoxy, I think neoliberalism, despite being absolute nonsense, still clearly actually has an awful lot of sway within very important institutions making very important decisions on a day-to-day basis, and I think that's really where the danger is.
Okay, well, following on from that, I want to pick up on that point. Actually, I think it's really interesting. Like, in terms of the way in which ideas create social change, a lot of what neoliberalism does, a lot of its power, has to do with the construction of our common sense, right? It's about the default answers that we presume to be, the right things to do. So, what is good economics? Like, what do you have to do when there's an economic crisis? The metaphors we live by, to use a kind of old title of a book that was relatively influential. This metaphor that the state is in some way comparable to the household has been really, really powerful since the financial crisis. And it doesn't stack up. Like, the explosion of household debt that you saw in the wake of the financial crisis directly corresponds to the need to bail out the financial system, right? That is why government debt exploded at that period in time. And the default response was to say, oh, well, we've got ourselves into this mess. We need to kind of, pull up our bootstraps and just work hard, take money out of the economy, and start paying off our debts, right? But it was completely nonsensical, because the levels of debt that you saw after 2008 as a result of the need to bail out a hugely over-leveraged financial system. You'd never be able to pay them off, right? Especially when you deliberately sell off RBS from the public purse at a rate that is completely underneath what it actually is valued at. I kind of went off on a tangent there. The role of neoliberalism in kind of constructing the answers that we think are going to be the best way to respond to crises is, I think, particularly important, reinforced by the teaching of economics, the economics profession most generally. So I think the work of post-crash economics in Manchester has been really, really important over the last couple of years. And even outside of the economics profession, outside of all the technical discussions that are going on and the disagreements there, you are quite right, and Keynes was quite right to say, the extent to which those ideas just pervade our thinking, and the way in which we're all like, I'm not an economist, I don't really understand any of this stuff, but presumably you just got to pay off your debt, right? Like that sort of stuff, it all is derived from this pervasive just set of common sense, basically, that we've seen emerge since the 80s, and which doesn't really correspond to reality, and which isn't supported by kind of much economic.
Ben, have you got a second mic? Do we have Ben? Ben?
Sorry, we've recruited him on the bar now, he's just washing the
Right. Oh, there he is.
Exactly the same.
Here it is. There you go. Yes, there's this gentleman here.
Oh, hi. My question, as I'm sure probably most people will be just general, predominantly is, well, first of all, I'm a bit of ignorant, so thanks for the name check of my company. But yeah, my main point was, do you think that neoliberalism is an ideology that's equipped to deal with the sort of major problems of our time? You know, obviously, party policy, major, I think, climate change. I think the sort of naked pursuit of like money as being the god above everything else, and just rampant short-termism. Is this really an ideology that's equipped to deal with the major problems facing society now?
Great question. So we'll go straight in with that then. Does anyone want to take that one on?
We were just talking about climate change actually, and IPPR at the moment are doing a lot of work on what we're calling, well, what has been called the Anthropocene. So broadly speaking, there are kind of geological time periods in the history of the Earth. There's like, you know, you have the Jurassic period, the Cretaceous period, whatever. And the last kind of, oh God, I don't know how long it's been actually, a couple of thousand years, there's been the Holocene. I think it's more than that, it's like 10,000 years. Then the Holocene, which has been a kind of fairly warm period fit for human habitation. And now we are moving into the Anthropocene, and Anthropos is the Latin term for man, and it basically means the geological era in which the most fundamental impact on the kind of Earth's climate and the Earth as a system is man's actions. So you've seen this. We've had one of the biggest rates of extinction of animals that has ever been witnessed, other than other great extinctions like the dinosaurs. We've had fundamental disruptions in things like the nitrogen cycle in a lot of Earth systems that underpin what makes the planet livable, not to mention obviously global warming as well. And this does come down to the pursuit of growth above all else. It comes down to the fact that the way we measure our economic well-being is a very narrow measure of GDP that doesn't take into account the degradation of the environment, let alone other issues like inequality. And neoliberalism is premised on constant growth. But this is one of the reasons why it's being really challenged at the moment, because it's failing to deliver that. And growth is very strongly correlated with more intensive use of resources that has led to climate change. So even if we were able to kind of, massively increase the extent to which we use renewables, maintaining the current level of consumption, if we were to extend the level of consumption that happens in the West to the rest of the world, we'd need 7 planets. It's not sustainable. We can't continue to just expect greater growth based on greater consumption with no kind of, respect for or understanding of the environmental limits imposed on our economic model by our environment. So yeah, no, it's not correct.
I'd just like to say, completely agree with that, but I think that going on to a more broader question about the incapability of neoliberalism to plan ahead in general, I think leads to all sorts of problems. So even, for example, accepting that sea levels are going to increase. Now, does that have to be a disaster when, for example, we know that half of Holland is built beneath sea level, protected by dams into the sea? Does it have to be a disaster for Bangladesh? As it's currently going forward, it looks like it will be. Because globally, as an economic system, we're not planning, we're not mitigating these efforts. The infrastructure is not going in place. So not just about in terms of preventing, for example, global warming, but also in terms about mitigating infrastructure and infrastructural development, neoliberalism is, from its nature, reduces down to the individual market interactions, not thinking about the longer term, not making those bigger decisions which are actually going to save money and lives in the medium to long term. And I think boils down to some of the issues that we were raising earlier about the long-term sustainability of growth through neoliberal policies.
Well, now it's all coming out in the open, isn't it, really? Because, when most people think, and I believe people in the audience think that we don't have enough growth, we've just heard that actually we should have much less of it, less consumption, and so on. Now, I'm surprised, with the greatest respect for Grace, that somebody who's read politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford can buy the World Wildlife Foundation, which is a £200 million organisation headquartered in Switzerland, and their doctrine, it's 7 planets that we need. Actually, their doctrine, which goes back at least 10 years, is 3 planets, and I wonder how they measure that. I mean, what's the units of measurement, as we say in physics, right? Because, are we talking about how much fossil fuels there are, how much animals there are, or, why do we just take on this very vulgar concept that we should consume less with our lovely smart meters, which we can rely upon the government to install successfully at a cost of £11 billion, to make sure, not that we get real-time pricing, because it won't do that, smart meters, but that we all feel guilty every time we put the central heating on. And we should rather adopt the Carter philosophy, which is put on a sweater. So, if I'm pro-growth, it doesn't make me a neoliberal. Just as if, I take seriously climate change. I've written a whole book about it, but I don't buy the false economics of 7 planets this. We need lower growth, we need lower consumption, we should all be conscious about our lifestyle in relation to energy. What the carbonistas, how many of you had, James? What the carbonistas say, what they fail to do, and I haven't heard a reply from either of my, too much consensus so far, but I want to be a pussycat tonight. What I haven't heard is what your program is for new industries and new technologies to absorb such unemployment as still exists and to take us forward beyond cybersecurity. That is a new industry at the moment. That's about the only one that we pioneered. Now, I've got a program for that, which is that far from cutting back our consumption, we should be investing in air capture of carbon dioxide, which is a long-term R&D program, which would actually turn, as marketing people say, a problem into an opportunity. Because you get the CO2 from the atmosphere and you turn it into artificial fuels. It's only green recycling on an industrial scale. I favour that as a new industry. I favour lots of R&D in that domain. I favour a full-on program of electric cars and a full-on program of nuclear to make sure that they are not polluting, electric cars are not powered by the old fossil fuel sources. So what the critique of neoliberalism doesn't do is put forward an alternative program, which we desperately need, of the industries that can solve our green problems and that can also take us forward rather than just scrabbling around with Uber. If Uber is new technology today, then I'm afraid ambitions really have narrowed and our fear of risk has got so great that we just want to push electrons around. We don't want the Trans-Pennine Link. We don't want anything big and scale. When in fact big is beautiful, not small is beautiful, as Schumacher said. I know I've got you.
Just to say, I think I did give one example of a vast infrastructural engineering project which could, be very much invested in, which is, for example, helping to dam Bangladesh in the future of, in the view of future funding. And just to ask, I'm sure Grace is perfectly capable of defending herself, but I don't really understand why there is a conflict between the aims which you just listed out there and anything that was just said here. I don't think anybody was saying that we're against growth. I think what people were saying were that the current growth and the current mechanisms for producing the energy to sort of create the current consumption is unsustainable. And actually, more investment in different types of energy, in different types of renewables, and effectively a different type of energy consumption economy is a vital way forward. That does not preclude growth whatsoever. It doesn't preclude consumption. I want to bring the world up to a Western living standard and beyond. That's certainly my personal political ambition. And I don't see a conflict here between having a sort of a rational, planned out, long-term view towards protecting the environment and raising people's living standards globally. In fact, quite the opposite.
I'll just briefly respond, I guess. So the first question is, do we need, so I think James kind of putting me up on this argument that we should be trying to aim for kind of degrowth, right? So like reducing, kind of moving away from a model in which GDP growth is even measured or considered or whatever. And I think it's an interesting debate. Probably not politically plausible or perhaps economically plausible. The point I was raising was that we only measure growth. And this is, really come to the fore in some of the research that we've been doing recently. Everyone's like, the economy's fine because GDP growth's up and employment's high. Well, no. I mean, firstly, there are a whole other load of economic metrics that aren't included in that. But it also doesn't include just like, human well-being, right? Or the well-being of our planet, or kind of levels of inequality, or people's actually lived experience of the world. So GDP growth is a useful measure in some ways, I suppose. It literally measures the amount that we are producing, the amount that we are buying. But if we are living in a world where that is the only thing that we think is important, and obviously, you determine what is important by what you measure, then I think that's pretty sad and probably not aligned with what most people would view as, like good human goals.
Fantastic. Well, you certainly managed to get some conflict there in the panel, and everyone else got a wedge to drive between them. Yes, at the back there. Yes. Follow.
Ready for the wedge. I'd like to ask, is it better to be employed, even with a low-paid job, given the benefits to be gained from so doing, such as regular hours, contact with other people, self-discipline, learning skills, old and new, and the opportunity to apply for a better job when you've acquired some useful experience, given the poor outcomes from generations of unemployed local people in our area historically?
There we go. James, you want to start? No. Very good.
Sorry, is it better to be employed on a low-paid job than what? Not be employed?
Yeah.
But still supported in your living standard? Is that what you're asking?
I think I'm sort of talking about the social benefits of employment as a possible balance. When obviously it's not the ideal outcome economically, and for the kind of standard of living that people have. But there are social benefits to be gained from having a low-paid job with a view to something better in the future, and that's not all glue kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is a good point. Obviously, we gain a lot from. Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. We do gain a lot from work other than obviously just pure economic value. And this is another issue that economists have, which is the way we analyse pay is basically like you get disutility from work. So you kind of work makes you unhappy, and you balance that off against having a wage, which is, incorrect. A lot of us love our jobs. I love my job. Get to, come here and do fun things like this. But, there's a question about whether or not, about wages that you're paid for doing that, right? It is of benefit to be in employment and have a good job that you like? Yes, of course. Is it a good thing to be in employment in a job that you hate? The pressures, that puts you under a tremendous amount of pressure, pays you very little, and ultimately doesn't provide you with a good standard of living that allows you to kind of flourish and feed your family and all that sort of stuff. And we are really seeing now, especially in like housing costs and general levels of inflation, rates of pay that are eroding people's standards of living, and causing things like homelessness, which I know you're kind of a specialist on. So it's great for people to have jobs, to have good jobs, to have the prospect of progression, to have things that interest them, but ultimately they need to get paid enough to be able to do it.
I was just going to come back and say as well, I think that, so to try and answer in two ways, I think taking a macro perspective on the types of jobs that people are working as well is also useful, because there's a kind of an implicit neoliberal assumption that just anything will do whatever, and there's not really a question about why people who would have been working in skilled trades 20 years ago are now looking at working on the checkout at Tesco's today. I think this goes back to, if we use a historical analogy here, the pre-war service or the interwar service economy. So, there would have been a classical liberal economic defence of, for example, having a maid that you pay on their wages, and the argument would be, well, better me paying them than not paying them. I'm contributing to the economy by employing somebody on a wage, and that's actually doing them good. And in that microcosmic sense, the argument is absolutely valid, of course. Like, that individual would rather be working and they'd rather be doing this. But I thought what was interesting is that during the war, the service sector was completely obliterated from British society, as everybody who was left of working age was basically drafted into work in factories and munitions and practical work. And for decades after the war, we retained that. So the famous British butler was basically destroyed by the Second World War, amongst other sort of professions. And what we had was a society full of useful, productive work, actually producing real wealth in industry, or, on the other side of it, a complete litany of new service sector occupations. So people like conductors on buses, park keepers. Preston used to have its own telescope, and you used to have a city astronomer that used to be able to go and visit Preston's telescope with a city astronomer. So the post-war Keynesian sort of social democratic consensus did create new service sector jobs, but actively created jobs which were enriching and socially valuable. So not just in terms of the wage, which was good, but also in terms of people's enjoyment and sense of fulfillment. And that actually, in and of itself, opened up a whole new array of blue sky thinking in things like research and things like whether or not people felt that they wanted to sort of go into different professions and experience different things on a personal level. And absolutely, I think that there is definitely like a desire, in a situation where it's either or, you're unemployed or you're not. Like, yeah, of course, employment's a better option. But I think to get stuck, just focused down on that one situation, is to lose the bigger picture. You can't see the wood for the trees when you get down to that level. Because actually the bigger picture is that more and more people are working in uninspiring jobs which don't give them fulfillment, they don't give them the proper wage that they're living on either, and it doesn't need to be that way.
I think there's no disagreement that half a loaf is half a loaf, really, not much cop. In the call that I've made for new industries, I stress that they be high-paying jobs that are in competitive new industries. Just let me outline a few more, which might give us some optimism. Clever pipes. Pipes handle water, fossil fuels, electricity, if BT ever delivers. They go into the bottom of houses and buildings. And if you've ever looked at pipes, you have to be a bit of a sadhead to do that. You'll see that they are not all singing, intelligent and all of that. They're rubbish, really, most of them. Not only in the home, but the industrial ones. Medical devices combining with pharmaceuticals and the digital world. Just this week, you'll have seen that guy who was 15 years, a vegetable, has been woken up by an implant in his head, and there's the fusion of drugs, IT, and medical devices like inhalers. There's already 50,000 people in this country in medical devices. So let's put that forward. We talk about recycling the carbon in the atmosphere for fuel, but what's happened to graphene? Graphene manufactured in Manchester, 2004. Oh yeah, innovation's speeding up. Who's seen any graphene anywhere? There's none. Nothing's happening there. And yet it could be a whole new industry. Service robots for older people. That means me. I'm in favour of it. And so on. Now, I'm delighted that you didn't react to nuclear reactors, including small modular reactors. But if anybody would like to tell me exactly how many people have died from fracking in the United States, I'd be very happy to buy them a drink, because I can tell you it's about 10 or 20. Most of the most of the deaths are of cows, and most of the ruckus is about farmers not feeling that they're reimbursed enough. I touched on electric cars, and batteries are part of that. I think it's time to revive supersonic transport. We want whole new industries with whole new jobs that are exciting, that are well paid, that are secure, that are competitive on the world market. Not because we love competition on the world market, but because we don't want to have everybody doing a labour-intensive regime where you spend all your time like a hamster in a wheel, saving energy and not automating it. We need automation, but we also need durable jobs. We can square that circle, and I think we can, then we're going forward. So I agree, good jobs, better than crap jobs, better than no jobs, right? It's as simple as that. We need a programme for good jobs.
Fantastic. So just keen to get as many questions in now. So I think we'll take 3, and if I can ask you and our speakers to be concise with them, we maybe do a few more as well. So from this side of the room, that's right, James. From this side of the room, we haven't had anyone. So should we start over here? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you just touched on a few of, I think, what your own ideas for how we can move forward. And something I think you said earlier was that a lot of the ideas for neoliberalism really are old ideas being recycled. And the way that I see the debate at the moment is that to very complex and modern problems, we are in many ways reverting to old ideas on both sides of the spectrum, whether it's left or right. And that perhaps we need more of a revolutionary approach to how we change our economic system and how we approach social good and value in general. And I just wondered, obviously you touched on a few of yours, but what are the ideas that excite you for what comes after neoliberalism or what comes next? My own are things like universal basic income and land tax and things like that, but just wondered what are a few of yours, and also how do you plan on implementing those kind of things in a world that's really driven by old powers that don't want those things to change and those new industries to emerge. So how do you deal with that?
Fantastic question, really great. Gentleman at the back, really stretching.
Sorry, I wrote it down. Right. In David Harvey's book, he talks about neoliberalism as a hegemony, dominating culture as well as social, economic, and political policy through the manifestation of individual freedom is common sense. This is currently reflected through liberal discussions on contemporary issues of personal freedom, such as gender politics and censorships, as the focus of liberation shifts from the individual in a market zone to the individual in a cultural zone. Do you think it is really the end of neoliberalism if the left is still so focused on these type of neoliberal cultural discussions?
Great, fantastic. Yes, sir, I've seen you made hand a few times.
Yeah, I'm still confused about this neoliberalism term. It doesn't make sense to me. Could you, panelists, please expand on 2 issues that you've kind of avoided to explain why neoliberalism as a term is helpful? Firstly, education. So education rapidly expanded in the 80s and 90s. Is this an example of neoliberalism? Because it kind of fits into Charlie's prison industrial complex, where it becomes a head kosh rather than a physical kosh. Secondly, housing. There's a huge amount of demand for more housing. So why throughout the 70s, 80s and 90s has housing not been built? If we've got neoliberalism and if we've got a liberal economy, surely we would have a whole load more houses. Why haven't we?
Okay, great. So does anyone of them stand out to anyone in particular? James is sort of gesticulating about old ideas being recycled.
Well, just on that. You raised a very good question now. Does anybody here know what the word Sinn Féin means? Ourselves alone. So the answer to you about housing, and I'm sure you've experienced this yourself, Charlie, and the answer about new industries is only we can put forward an alternative to the old ideas. And of course, I know that you spend most of your time when you're in the pub, because you're in Manchester, discussing South Sea technologies and things like that, right? And lobbying for them at local mass demonstrations, right? All the chemical and biological and mineral wealth that's at the bottom of the sea, just to add another sector that we could go into. But I'm not hearing it from Manchester yet. So the point is, we've got to go out there and argue for that, right? We've got to say there's not enough automation, it's not happening, there's not enough investment, it's not happening. We need to cut a lot of bullshit, like homeopathy, out of the NHS, and start getting serious about something that could make a real difference, rather than something that if you dilute it enough and you get nothing out of nothing, then you'll get something. You know, it's the most irrational theory I've heard. And the prevalence of that kind of doctrine is just something that gives a lie to neoliberalism as an overarching theory. So I'm saying, let's get together, let's debate these new industries, let's put forward a new program, let's indeed, I take your point, Charlie, and I'm sorry if I got it wrong, let's indeed do some climate change adaptation in Bangladesh, build new ramparts, don't make the mistake that the US Army engineers made with Katrina, when they just didn't defend New Orleans against bad weather events, right? Let's go forward with that and articulate a positive high-tech vision, which is not what we hear from left to right. You're entirely right about these old ideas. So ourselves alone are the people we can rely on.
Okay, I'll try and be succinct. So the last question about education / housing neoliberalism. So education and neoliberalism, neoliberalism in the context of education means a lot of the reforms we've seen in the last several years. So the marketisation of particularly higher education, the introduction of large and affordable tuition fees. In secondary education, it's academisation, so the introduction of the profit motive and academic chains into state provision. And you see a lot of stuff there about the kind of the pay of directors of academies being insane and the sucking out of value from the public sector and the private sector. When it comes to housing, housing is interesting because you're quite right. If market forces did control the housing market, we wouldn't have a housing crisis. The issues there are around the way in which neoliberalism and neoliberal politics advances certain interests and promotes certain interests in the political and economic sphere. So the situation around housing benefits homeowners, right? If we build more houses, house prices go down, and a lot of Tory voters get slightly poorer. So is it the end of neoliberalism if we've still got the culture wars? I would like to think that any post-neoliberal order would render us better able to respond to questions about race, gender, all these different sorts of things, because a big part of neoliberalism is just the undermining of respect for the integrity of the human being, right? Human beings, as Polanyi said, are treated as commodities, and they're not commodities, they're humans. We are worth more than our monetary value. And I think a lot of the issues around the culture wars can be traced back to that denigration of inherent value of human beings, whether because they're women they're treated as commodities, or you look like you want to say something.
Isn't that neoliberalism actually focus on the
Yeah. Grab the podcast.
Isn't the idea of neoliberalism the actual focus on the individual and self-interest and greediness? Margaret Thatcher said, "There is no society."
So that kind of individualisation is definitely a big part of neoliberalism. I think it's interesting the way in which actually many of the things you're talking about, so the culture wars, which are, they're collective issues, they are collectivist issues. You're talking about, the rights and interests of women or of ethnic minorities, that is a group issue. But in many ways, you're right, it has become this kind of individualised phenomenon of, you know, I'm big, like, you know, liberal feminism, right? Like, lean in, like, what do we need to do to defeat patriarchy? Just, you know, make sure you go to your boss and ask for a bit more money. Like, yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff is true. There is a way of marrying, you know, respect for the integrity of human beings, regardless of their kind of external characteristics, with a progressive economic agenda. And I think the left can and perhaps should get better at doing that. Finally, sorry, quickly, we need new revolutionary ideas, completely agree. UBI, interesting, a lot of stuff around that. Land value tax, another interesting thing. The thing you asked what we're excited about, the things I'm excited about are, rather than UBI, something called UBD, Universal Basic Dividend, combined with the socialisation of finance. So the kind of decentering of liberal financial capitalism from the way in which ownership is kind of constructed, and moving towards a system of kind of stakeholder capitalism in which the public sector and in which ordinary people are stakeholders and are owners rather than economic rentiers. So universal basic dividend would be kind of, you know, the state takes a 10% cut of any IPO and uses the dividends from those shares to finance a universal basic dividend, which would not be an income, it would be a right that you get as part of your, you know, ownership, part ownership of the state, and the state's part ownership of those companies. That then goes some way towards socialising finance, so moving away from a kind of very short-termist, you know, orientation of finance, which just involves, you know, high-frequency trading that doesn't really benefit anyone or really take
particular light on any given area of policy. However, it is still somehow the ideology of those making the decisions. I mean, you know, I mean, I can give you sort of various theories as to why, but I'm as flabbergasted as anyone sometimes. The fact that these philosophies keep on getting trotted out in the face of direct contradictions. I mean, what I would say in terms of some of the specific questions is that the education issue, absolutely, there has been a marketisation of education, there has been an increase, but if we're talking about, for example, the increase in education involvement of people, again, if we go back to the post-war period, and obviously that wasn't to do with neoliberalism, but I wasn't just trying to literally draw sort of a straight line between, you know, demand for prisons as like being the same as demand for education. The purpose of talking about prison industrial complex was to talk to the perverse antisocial side effects of the introduction of a market mechanism into the concept of law and order and justice, and the perverse side effects of basically creating, in the name of individual liberty, powerful, unaccountable corporations capable of lobbying politicians to do things like increase sentence lengths. You know, these are all sorts of strange, twisted sort of aberrations that emerge from basically what is an innately incomprehensible neoliberal framework, which simply does not work. I think the point I was trying to make initially was precisely that. It doesn't make sense as a term, yet it is very important. Sorry, could you remind me just of your question a little bit?
Basically.
Sorry, podcast. Basically, David Harvey, right, describes neoliberalism as a hegemony. So, as well as economic domination, political domination, social domination, it's also a cultural domination. The idea of the individual being free, and basically how this is sort of reflected in contemporary debates within the left. You know, for example, surrounding gender politics, you know, the free gender or censorship. So people wanting to be free to express opinion in a safe space. And then I said, is it really the end of the line for neoliberalism if the left is still so focused on these culturally neoliberal conversations?
Well, in answer to that, I think that's a very pertinent question. But what I would say is that the rise of individualism, I would mark from before and unconnected to the rise of neoliberalism. I think that neoliberalism probably benefited from the rise of individualism, but I think that the rise of individualism arose from the breakdown of working class collectivity in the 1950s and 60s through the development of, Hobsbawm would have it that a working class with more consumer capital were able to start defining themselves in terms of consumer identities as opposed to working class collectivity. This is materialist analysis of how individualism managed to rise in the 1960s. So sort of as a product basically of material wealth. And I think there's probably a lot of truth in that. And as well as that, I don't want to use the word collectivity like I've got some sort of romantic notion of it. I think there were problems with some of the cultures which came before, and the new individualism brought problems with it as well, but also solved some of the old problems as well. But I would say that one of the issues with that individualism was, I think, its susceptibility to be co-opted as an idea of radicalism, which was about personal self-development and personal self-gain. And the neoliberals very savvily cottoned on to this idea of being some sort of radical political movement in the 1980s, which was casting off the shackles of the staid old sort of nanny state and bringing people forward into a brave new world of personal dynamism and I think I'm going to reference that fake video of the Tory Party youth video. But they very successfully did that, and I think that built upon some of the weaknesses in cultural individualism, which were a part of British and Western society by that point. But I think they are distinct processes, and I think there is also, as a socialist, I'm ultimately a socialist because I want maximum freedom of the individual. I want the absence of material constraints for individuals. I want individuals to be able to have the fullest freedom to define themselves and to live a full human existence on this planet. And my personal feeling, and what I believe the evidence shows, is that the best mechanism towards this goal is collective organisation, collective production, removing the profit motive from interactions between people and actually having production which is for what it is. So production for consumption and lives that people are designed to live in, rather than effectively seen as economic cogs in a broader system of creating growth, profit, etc.
Thank you. Okay, well, so we can do two more very, very quick fire questions. And then the evening will end, the evening will not end. Please stay around to interact with one another. I think our speakers are going to certainly stay for a little bit, so you can come and ask any questions there. We'll leave it to sum up. Yes, there'll be a brief summing up in a bit. Yes, first one in here. Yeah, second row.
I just wanted to ask that on the points of good jobs, crap jobs and no jobs, wouldn't it make more sense, instead of like growing new industries, to make the crap jobs less crap, and like making sure that people can actually live a good life, not just survive on a decent wage, even though they're like not that educated or not that high up in the social hierarchy, and also respecting the value of social reproduction. So as in like taking care of your child or your household, then like making sure that good enough jobs, and then still upholding basically the hierarchy of like good jobs, crap jobs, and no jobs.
Okay, cool. And one last question, if I've neglected this side of the room. Yes. Second row.
Grace, you mentioned that a paradigm shift in economic thought would be necessary in order to end neoliberalism, and that such a shift would be brought by certain economic crises. Linking that to what Charlie said regarding the pervasive neoliberal values which permeate throughout all levels of society, would those economic crises be enough to cause a shift in that thought amongst everyone, or would it take sort of a humanitarian crisis for those who are not economically minded to, get rid of those thought processes? If so, what sort of humanitarian crisis? And are they one and the same? Would one cause the other at the natural consequences of each?
Okay, great. Well, two great questions to end up on. If you want to take them on and then make a brief final statements, that'd be great.
I think just as an example of that, I think what you said at the end, does one precipitate the other? I think yes. I think just some examples from the Great Depression. Loads of accounts of, there's a joke I think in American society that, during the Great Depression you would never see a rabbit running across a field without about 3 guys chasing it. The extent to which the poverty which emerged from that crash actually impacted upon people's day-to-day lives, I think, was immense. You had the perverse scenario of food banks and people waiting in queues for their soup in big cities, and coffee beans being burnt as fuel in Latin America because the export price had dropped through the floor, so they were more effectively used as fuel on trains than it was to be exported to actually be used. And I think that yes, an economic crisis left unchecked very quickly becomes a humanitarian crisis. But the scale and the extent to which it needs to be at before change is actually inculcated is an open question. So something of the scale of the Second World War needed to happen in the first time round for that change to be implemented. You would hope that something similar wouldn't have to be organised this time round too. But some things which don't necessarily vote in our favour is that the post-Second World War, we had an incredibly organised labour movement. We had millions and millions of working class people actively forming a progressive social identity, organised into civil societies, organised into trade unions, actively politically aligning and encouraging and involved in the process of pushing forward this change. And although I think that we probably are in the process of building some of this again, it's nowhere near the strength that it was. So I think there's no room for complacency and no room to sit back. There's some sort of catastrophist theories who kind of believe that the disaster will bring about its own end. I'm not one of those. I think that it can go either way.
Okay, I'll start with your question, Candice. So the kind of good jobs, bad jobs, no jobs hierarchy. Yeah, I mean, I really do think that people need to be able to survive even if they don't have a job, right? And also that the forms of work that we do, of social reproduction that we do that aren't rewarded in any way, need to be at least recognised and probably, rewarded. We need to respect that kind of work, and just in the sense of what I was saying earlier, just in the sense of respecting the fundamental dignity of human beings, right? Which is what neoliberal capitalism so transparently fails to do. Then the question about crisis. Will we need a humanitarian crisis for this to happen? What you were saying about like changing people's mindsets and the way people think, and like how does that happen, and how does a crisis allow that to happen? I was actually having a conversation earlier about the profession of geology and how plate tectonics. They came up with the theory of plate tectonics like a really long time ago. It was some young geologists within the profession. And they kind of proved this, and they were able to show that this was, absolutely categorically true. But it wasn't accepted until 20, 30 years later, because all the professors at the top who decided what was the received wisdom had all built their careers on a pre-tectonic plate mindset. So basically all of their dying, / not being professors anymore, for what is just a transparently true geological fact to become accepted as received wisdom, right? And so I think, that what the crisis does, it changes the people in power. If you are, in power during a kind of dramatic economic crisis that might happen, I mean, I hope this would obviously be transformed into a humanitarian crisis. There's a really interesting book actually by a guy called Wolfgang Streeck called How Will Capitalism End, and looks at what will happen, when neoliberalism does fail, and it is bleak, right? If we fail to do something about it, it's really bleak. This new system doesn't just create itself. So yeah, I mean, we start to see changes in the people in power, and that's how I think that transmission mechanism happens. But importantly, the crisis doesn't just create its own solution. It's not like we have a crisis, everything changes, and suddenly everything's fine again. Like the work of replacing neoliberalism is down to every single one of us, right? And like in an age where we are all denied our kind of the basic human dignity that is required to kind of have interesting, connected, social lives, and to be happy and to be able to support ourselves and to be able to live well, it is such a huge demand to say no. Like, I'm taking that back. I'm taking back my right to a good life, to a house, to a family, to as I said, basic human dignity. I am not a commodity, right? Standing up and saying those things before the crisis, so that when the crisis comes, we are mobilized and we are ready and we are capable to replace it with a system that, allows us to be the best possible people that we can be. It is work, right? And we are hopefully getting to a place where we are starting to do some of that work now, but we do not have a lot of time.
Just to start with your point, I don't think anybody wants to undervalue mothering or childcare and so on. I've never been a mother myself, but you know, I've been a parent, and I do understand the point that you're making. But you know, Charlie, when you say that Hobsbawm, you know, indicted the individualism of the 60s, you know, what I remember was the women's liberation movement, as it then was, calling for 24-hour nurseries, not because we wanted all our kids to be in state nurseries for 24 hours a day, but because we recognised that women should go out to work to get away from the kitchen sink. And I think that remains very important. And, you know, really, I don't believe the individualism set in the 60s. It's more to do with the 80s. The miners' strike, the first one, if our amnesia doesn't go too far, was in 73. Women's liberation movement, a little bit earlier than that, part of the 60s. Grunwick, if you remember the Grunwick strike, you had Shirley Williams, who was a member of the SDP, on the picket line. I know what I'm talking about because I was at Grunwick's. And I saw Arthur Scargill lead a charge there. That was in 78. Right? You would not get Sir Vince Cable on a picket line today, you know. So, you know, we need to get our periodization right, and we need to recognize that we've gone backwards, actually, since the 60s. And, you know, we're still retailing very old ideas. Now, if we're thinking about old ideas, let me just say that, you know, I'm surprised how much recognition David Harvey has got right here, because I can't think of a worse theorist of capitalism. He said, and I quote, "The urban process has more universal meaning than the specific analysis of any particular mode of production." Well, that's great. Cities are more important than political economy. No, political economy is the key to cities. Not cities are more important than political economy. Now, I think, you know, we've heard some critical remarks about Keynes. Going to your point, sir, let's not go back to Keynes, right? Especially as we're all Keynesians now, since the crash. He said in the preface, interestingly enough, to the German edition of the General Theory. Did you know this, Charlie? It's a great quote. He says, "The theory of output as a whole, which is what the following book purports to provide, is much more easily adapted to the conditions of a totalitarian state than is blah, blah, blah." Right? So what he's saying is, Keynesianism is compatible with Hitlerism. That Hitler put Keynes into practice with the motorways and the autobahns and so on. I didn't say that, he said that. So let's be sure that in any new theory that we have, I disagree on UBI, I disagree on UBD, but whatever we do, let's not go back to Keynes. What's been so refreshing about tonight, and I hope it's one thing we can agree on, is that there's been such terrific free speech. And that's something that we need more argument and more heat, because out of that will come light. Right? If anybody wants to call me a tosser, it's fine. It's about as savoury and as convincing an argument as neoliberalism and its critics. Right? But if they want to call me that, it's fine, because out of that we can come to clarity, and we desperately need that now.
Well, let's go around and talk I don't know what how you do that, so I can't figure myself, so thank you, James. Just before we all start talking, and you are still a captive audience, just two quick plugs. One for Texture, for putting this on, without who we wouldn't be here, so thank you very much. Donations, signalling.
If you can, just a couple of quid. We do have running costs, we'd like to keep them free, but we'll put this up there and there, so you can.
And excitingly, our next event coming up on the 4th of November, Saturday, is an all-day event. It's part of the Battle of Ideas Festival, but a satellite event in Manchester, where Angela Nagle will be taking part in a provocation debate. Oh, there we are.
Yeah, it's all right.
Just to be next person.
Yeah. Scroll down.
So Angela Nagle will be taking part in a provocation debate on her new book, Kill All Normies, and there will be a panel discussion on identity politics and culture wars with a fabulous, splendid panel, much like our panel tonight. So another round of applause to them, and put it on after.